Welcome to the Criminologist podcast. Our goal here is to educate and enlighten our listeners, focusing on the latest and greatest evidence-based interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. And not only those factors which drive folks into crime, we also look at the reasons why people exit a life of crime. Also, we attempt to paint an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those involved in the system are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality. This podcast will avoid stereotypes and biases. We will endeavor to accomplish the first two goals in a way that keep you, the listener, interested and even entertained. And now, the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Thank you all very much. Hello and welcome to episode 35 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, in honor of the Christmas season, I'm going to be taking a look at a fictitious character to help illustrate some of the themes that we talk about here on the show. We've done this in the past. We've looked at Elvira Hancock from Brian De Palma's Scarface. We looked at Mia Wallace from Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction. We have even taken a stab at assessing the real-life Henry Hill as portrayed in the film Goodfellas. This week, in honor of the Christmas season, we are bringing you a very special Christmas edition of the Criminologist podcast. At least we hope it's very special, as we assess and take a look at both criminogenic variables and desistance variables through the lens of the one and only Mr. Ebenezer Scrooge from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Now, hopefully most of you are familiar with the character of this week's client, Ebenezer Scrooge. If you are not familiar with Charles Dickens' story, A Christmas Carol, either have not read the book or seen one of the many film iterations of the classic Christmas fable in a while, here is a taste of Ebenezer Scrooge.
Merry Christmas, Uncle! Humbug! 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 Christmas a humbug, Uncle.
You don't mean that, I'm sure.
Humbug! 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 Humbug!
And so there we have just a little bit of a taste of our client today, Ebenezer Scrooge. Like I said, I am going to take a stab at what could be interpreted as criminogenic variables in Ebenezer. If not impactful enough to lead to outright criminality, certainly potent enough to result in his overall Scrooginess. And then I want to view his redemption, if you will, through the lens of desistance and what we know as to rewriting of narratives, identity transformation, maybe even altering his social capital a bit. So let's hop on Santa's sleigh and embark on our journey of discovery as we unfold the Criminologist Christmas Carol. Now, there are a variety of assessments in use today to examine criminogenic factors, but they all examine criminogenic need as outlined in The Psychology of Criminal Conduct by James Bonta and Don Andrews. And to recap what those variables are, which are often termed the central 8, again, regardless of the assessment tool you're using, they are categories such as criminal history, deficits around employment and education, strife and conflict in family and marital, significant other relationships, a void with pro-social leisure and recreational activities in one's life, alcohol and drug problems, antisocial personality, pro-criminal associates, peers in other words, and then pro-criminal attitude orientation. And if you want to learn a little bit more about criminogenic variables, I encourage you to check out my YouTube video entitled Criminogenic Needs Explained. That is on my YouTube channel, also entitled The Criminologist. I will leave a link to that video in the show description of this episode. A Christmas Carol opens on a bleak, cold Christmas Eve in London, 7 years after the death of Ebenezer Scrooge's business partner, Jacob Marley. Scrooge, an aging miser, dislikes Christmas and refuses a dinner invitation from his nephew Fred, the son of his dead sister Fan. He turns away 2 men who seek a donation from him to provide food and heating for the poor, and only grudgingly allows his overworked, underpaid clerk, Bob Cratchit, Christmas Day off with pay to conform to the social custom. So what do we see here as far as criminogenic risk factors with Ebenezer Scrooge, and or if you are familiar with the story and perhaps are a savvy criminogenic assessor? Let's take a look at these 8 domains one by one, beginning with criminal history. Likely not much here as to official brushes with the criminal justice system. Of course, in reality, this would be done through a criminal history check as well as directly interviewing the client. But again, if we are adhering to the story, really not much here as far as official interactions reflective of a criminal history. Moving on to the domain of education and employment, Mr. Scrooge had a formal education, recall his apprenticeship, so not going to score risk on any of the education items. Mr. Scrooge is gainfully employed, so non-risk on several of those items as well. Let's look, though, at his interactions with coworkers, peer interactions specifically with his employee, Bob Cratchit. I would score that as risk. Here we're looking at indications reflective of problems with fighting, arguing, problems on the job. So again, I don't think it's a stretch to say that there was a little bit of risk here with Mr. Scrooge and his coworker, Bob Cratchit.
Fine excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December. Well, I suppose you must have the whole day. You'll be here all the earlier the next morning. Yes, sir. Mary?
I would then score a little bit of risk based on the relationship with coworkers there for client Ebenezer Scrooge. Let's move on to the domain of family and marital relationships. Here, when assessing one's significant other, we generally look at the period within the last year. So don't go back to the long-lost love of Ebenezer's past when he was younger, when he neglected his fiancée, Belle. She is shown ending their relationship as she realizes that he'll never love her as much as he loves money. So if you're scoring that relationship back then, perhaps you would look at that indication of conflict over money as a factor to be considered. For this assessment, though, we will assess him within his current single status, which, frankly, he would appear to be content with. So no risk on that specific item. Both parents are dead. That's automatic risk. We know this, for example, because there's no prosocial modeling going on from the parents. So whenever you have a client, both clients are deceased, generally speaking, that would be scored as risk. As to other relatives, we can look to his nephew Fred. This is actually somewhat tricky since the behavior being modeled by Fred is actually quite supportive and caring, despite Ebenezer being standoffish and refuting his efforts at being closer. Otherwise, I would not score or assess his late sister Fan, since again, time frames we look at here are generally within the last year. Even if Fan were around, though, as she was prosocial, we would not score that relationship as risk. Looking at the domain of leisure and recreational activities in Ebenezer's life, risk here, I would say, no signs of any prosocial, structured, recreational activities in Ebenezer's life. Again, recall social learning theory. That is one of the theoretical foundations of Bonta and Andrews' general personality and cognitive social learning theory. Involvement in pro-social leisure activities equates to pro-social modeled behavior. Involvement in these types of groups with pro-social individuals would serve to buffer Ebenezer against risk. I don't see any positive pro-social recreational activities in his life, so I'm going to assess as risk in that area. Moving on to companions or peers. We know, of course, that the field of criminology has for a long time acknowledged the effects of acquaintances and friends on a person's beliefs and values and, of course, their behavior. And again, this is due to the fact that they serve as models for behavior. The tighter that bond, the more influential the modeling. First, we must ask ourselves to examine whether Ebenezer has any friends or acquaintances who are modeling delinquent or criminal behavior. Now, as an assessment scoring tip, I can tell you that by definition, even if your clients are not real close with their coworkers, you, generally speaking, would be able to score those coworkers as at least acquaintances. Even if there's a loose connection there, that would be scored as acquaintances. And with that, we could probably take a look at Bob Cratchit as an acquaintance. We would then ask the question, does Bob model prosocial or criminal behavior? And I would contend that Bob is prosocial, therefore no risk with that connection, with that acquaintance that we score. Now here's where this section can get a little bit tricky sometimes in the real world. So we did not assess as risk here because there was a void or a lack of criminal friends and acquaintances in Ebenezer's life. But he would take a hit, so to speak, on the flip side of that because there are no prosocial friends or prosocial acquaintances in his life. Being a social isolate, if you will, reflects as risk here to a degree for Scrooge. He does not have sufficient prosocial criminal friends and acquaintances in his life to model prosocial behavior. He doesn't have those folks that would buffer against risk, if you will. So that is going to be reflective of risk. So on the one hand, he does not get assessed as risk because he doesn't surround himself with a lot of criminal and delinquent friends and associates. But on the flip side, he's not surrounding himself with a lot of prosocial friends and prosocial acquaintances. So that will come out there. Moving on to alcohol and drug issues with Mr. Scrooge, frankly, I just don't see it. So no risk in this area for Ebenezer. Finally, moving on to taking a look at his pro-criminal attitudes and orientations. As to this assessment here, what do we think of Ebenezer? His values, beliefs, and cognitive emotional states. And by cognitive emotional states, I mean, do we see rage, anger, that kind of thing? Does he minimize and rationalize his negative behaviors? That's what we try to determine with our clientele, really. Are they supportive of crime and societal norms? How do they feel as to their terms and conditions of probation or parole and even the offense that they committed? Well, with Mr. Scrooge, what did we learn from Charles Dickens? Again, we can examine events early in the story before he's visited by the spirits for some insight here. See how he treats Bob Cratchit and his nephew Fred. What about the two gentlemen who come by his shop soliciting on Christmas Eve for funds for the poor.
Prisons? Plenty of prisons. The workhouses, they're still in operation? They are. I wish I could say they were not. The treadmill, the poorhouses, still in full vigor? All very busy, sir. I was afraid from what you said that something had stopped them in full force. A few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink, and food and warmth. Oh, what can we put you down for, sir? Nothing. You wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone. Since you asked me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. My taxes help to support the public institutions which I have mentioned, and they cost enough. Those who are badly off must go there. Many can't go there, and many would rather die. If they would rather die, perhaps they had better do so, and decrease the surplus population. Surely you don't mean that, sir? With all my heart.
Now, I would not go so far to say Scrooge is, quote-unquote, supportive of crime, but he does display a bit of moral disengagement. He utilizes what we refer to as techniques of neutralization. Since Scrooge is not on supervision, probation, or parole, this is a bit tougher to assess, but for the sake of argument, let's imagine he was convicted and sentenced to probation for some type of financial fraud offense. Playing fast and loose with the accounting books, let's say. Imagine for a moment his attitude towards his probation supervision. Can you envision the job of his poor probation officer? I imagine Ebenezer would have a horrible attitude toward his conditions and expectations of the court. At any rate, let's tally up those risk items for Mr. Scrooge. Couple of areas of risk were assessed in each: education, employment, the family marital section. We looked at leisure recreation activities and assessed risk there, and a little bit in companions due to that lack of pro-social friends and acquaintances in his life to model pro-social behavior. Now, even if we sprinkled in some risk assessment for those items in the attitudes and orientation portion of the scale, any way you slice it, Scrooge would be assessed as low risk to re-offend. A horrible person, by all means. Likely to recidivate within the next year? Fairly low, actually. But that, of course, is why we advocate the use of actuarial risk assessment tools. In the old days, the probation officer would have one conversation with Scrooge, their new client, and think, what a jackass. I'm going to have this clown report to my office every week. And conversely, that same probation officer may have a client who presents very well, comes off as very pro-social, and they might assign them to low reporting status simply based on that. And this, of course, is what we always preach to the practitioners. Trust the tool. Don't trust your instincts or your gut reactions. Trust the assessment tool. Next, let's continue our journey and take a look at Scrooge through the Desistance Lens. We know, of course, that time and the aging process often play a part in desistance, but with the aid of the three spirits, this process may have been accelerated a little bit in Mr. Scrooge. Scrooge awakens on Christmas morning a changed man. He makes a large donation to the charity he rejected the previous day, anonymously sends a large turkey to the Cratchit home for Christmas dinner, and spends the afternoon with Fred's family. The following day, he gives Cratchit an increase in pay and becomes a father figure to Tiny Tim. From then on, Scrooge treats everyone with kindness, generosity, and compassion, embodying the spirit of Christmas. Desistance from crime, of course, is much more than simply the absence of risk. Desistance is, among other things, a change in identity, a changing of one's narrative script. Let's take a look, for comparison's sake, at Ebenezer's narrative script and identity early in the story. Here he is very selfish, of course, cares little for his fellow man, as evidenced by his interaction with the two gentlemen collecting funds for the poor around Christmas. What, though, is his self-narrative, or his script, if you will, by the conclusion of the story? When he drops in on his nephew Fred for Christmas dinner, he asks Fred and his wife, "Can you forgive a stupid old man who doesn't want to be left out in the cold anymore? Will you take me in?" Ebenezer Scrooge seeks inclusion in their community. Recall primary desistance, secondary desistance, and tertiary desistance. Primary desistance, of course, being behavioral. Secondary desistance encompassing that assumption or taking on of a new identity, and tertiary desistance being that sense of belonging and recognition by others that one has changed. In this case, of course, nephew Fred and his friends and family are those seeing the change in Ebenezer. And we continue to see aspects of each of these thresholds of desistance throughout the remainder of the story. Back at work, Scrooge surprises Bob Cratchit with a big raise. That would be considered behavioral. So really reflection of primary desistance in Scrooge there. His behavior has changed. Things like him putting more coal on the fire, etc. Those behavioral things that we can overtly look at.
I'm going to raise your salary. Ha! Merry Christmas, Bob! Bob, Merry Christmas that I wish you in many a year. I'd like to help your family, if you'll let me. I will raise your salary, and we will discuss your affairs this afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires, and before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit, buy another coal scuttle.
As you can see, we really could talk about Ebenezer's transformation and check all three of those desistance boxes. Primary desistance, his behavior; secondary desistance, his identity; and tertiary desistance, his acceptance in a community. Recall, he does in fact bump into the two gentlemen collecting for the poor, and in fact remedies that situation by making a financial contribution as well. He, as we know, becomes a second father to Tiny Tim, more evidence of his behavioral metamorphoses. And as we know from the story, beyond his nephew Fred and Fred's household of guests, the entire town grows to accept Ebenezer, despite a little bit of skepticism, the new Scrooge in their community. Back to his identity, he has found Christmas in his heart. He's not the same person, on top of his behavioral changes, which of course is also the point we make with justice-involved individuals. Measuring simply recidivism is, in a certain sense, so very surfacey or cursory or what have you. Desistance is so much more than that. Take Scrooge. If he merely engaged in primary desistance, would the conclusion of A Christmas Carol be the same? For example, he would give Bob Cratchit the raise, but still be full of humbug. Still not be part of the community. He wouldn't be accepted by the community, that is. Same warm and fuzzy ending to A Christmas Carol? I, for one, think not, dear friends. And this, of course, is how we need to approach changes in the criminal justice system, how we need to continue to move that needle. If we really want to do desistance, we need to look beyond the behavioral metrics of recidivism and reoffending. We need to look at those other plateaus of secondary and tertiary desistance. One more thing that I want to cover, and here I want to cite the work of both Fergus McNeill and Shad Maruna. Both of those gentlemen have written about this notion of generativity, which is sort of like giving back as part of the desistance process. And I'm just going to read you directly from the work of Shad and Fergus because it's very important and I don't want to lose anything in translation. But when they talk about generativity, they talk about a concern for the well-being of others. In studies of people in desistance process, generativity often surfaces in their stated desires and active efforts to give something back or to make good on a troubled past. These processes are important, perhaps in securing the changes in identity sometimes associated with desistance from crime. It may also suggest tacit recognition of the need to make good in order to be seen by others as a reformed person. In these senses, there seems to be evidence of a link between giving up crime and giving back to victims or community or even future generations. So thank you, Shad Maruna and Fergus McNeill, for that insight. Taking a look at Scrooge, do we not see this in Scrooge himself? In the final chapter of A Christmas Carol, he is indeed giving back or making good.
No, I'm in earnest. Go and buy it, bring it back here, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sent it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that very special edition of the Criminologist podcast. We talked today about how practitioners really should trust their assessment tools when looking at criminogenic variables and get away from their gut instinct or their professional judgment. That's really back in the bad old days of first generation tools. Trust those actuarial tools. Trust the risk, need, responsivity principles. And as to desistance, again, hopefully begin looking beyond simply primary desistance, which could be measured through recidivism or reoffending. Again, those are those behavioral things. And really start contemplating what it looks like with our caseloads to start augmenting and talking about secondary desistance and even tertiary desistance. I hope I was able to illustrate those concepts with you all today through the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. So a shout out to Charles Dickens for his assistance with that. We will be back next week with a fresh episode, actually bringing you our special New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, end of year recap edition to the show, winding down season 2, and we'll be gearing up for season 3 in 2021. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices or implementation, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. I will leave a link to the Paragon Group in the episode description of this show. You can also reach us directly through email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us also through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast, Instagram at The Criminologist Podcast, or our Facebook page. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You do not want to miss out on that. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both The Criminologist Podcast page and the Paragon page on LinkedIn. Lastly, if you have not already done so, subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to what you have heard on this episode and others. Coffee mugs are available. Reach out for merchandise request. And if you believe in what we're doing here on the show, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker, a colleague about us. ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you have not already done so. And remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
And God bless us all, everyone.
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, training opportunities, or to contact the host, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. Click on the Contact Us tab in the upper right-hand side of the page. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.